Well, good afternoon and welcome everybody. We're here to give you the weekly update on managed isolation and quarantine systems. And today, of course, we will be addressing the issue of the co-payment scheme that the government parties have negotiated. Because as we all know, we are in somewhat of a unique situation here in New Zealand that few other countries are experiencing in the middle of this global pandemic. And as we all know, we have not got here by luck. We have got here by doing hard and early work in stamping out COVID in our communities. These hard-won freedoms we are enjoying, like going to work and school, meeting with people and socialising, eating in restaurants and playing sport, is not the experience of millions of others around the world. Globally, people are dealing with the very frightening spread of COVID. Overseas news reports remind us every day of just how important it is for us to remain vigilant and keep the robust response that has got our team of 5 million where we are today. New Zealand's managed isolation and quarantine system is our front line of this defence, and it is working. We have not had any cases of community transmission to date, and we are keeping cases of COVID contained at the border. This has had a considerable financial cost. We have so far set aside nearly $500 million to maintain the tight border that is our managed isolation system. A total of $479 million has so far been budgeted for and approved. Over the past several weeks, we have done a detailed investigation of options to recover some of the costs of this system. And as I've said many times, those options were always going to be a balance with the right of New Zealand citizens and permanent residents to return home. The global spread of Covid-19, resulting in economic downturn and change of circumstances for some people, means more New Zealanders will continue to want to come back to the safety of their home, New Zealand. And this is their right. We have carefully weighed up the impact of charging returnees some of the costs of managed isolation, and as a government we have negotiated on the best steps forward. And today I'm announcing that government parties have agreed to these settings, which can be altered by future governments. Legislation will be introduced to Parliament today that will enable regulations to be developed to recover some costs from some people. New Zealanders and permanent residents who are coming home to resettle here, to make their permanent homes here, to live their lives here, will not be charged. Temporary visa holders will have to pay costs unless they are ordinarily resident in New Zealand before the border closure on the 19th of March. And I intend to seek Cabinet agreement to a fee structure of $3,100 per person in a room, $950 for each additional adult, and $475 for each additional child. There will also be mechanisms to allow charges to be waived in full or in part. New Zealanders currently overseas who come back here for less than 90 days, and those who leave when the regulations come into force and return at a later date, will be charged for their stay in managed isolation. It is my view that this solution balances the right of New Zealanders to return home while ensuring those who intend to holiday here pay some of the costs of keeping our borders safe. This is only fair. Our managed isolation system is logistically complex and expensive to run. We have capacity for over 7,000 people in our facilities, and the systems in place are being robustly managed. At this stage, we have no plans to greatly extend our capacity. We recognised early on that managing the flow of people in and out of our managed isolation facilities is absolutely critical to the task at hand. Over the last several weeks, we have worked with airlines and airports to manage those flows of people coming across the border. We have also been working on a system to ensure that anyone buying an airline ticket here has an allocated space in a managed isolation facility. This is progressing well, and Air Commodore Webb will provide some more detail on this shortly. And I want to take a moment to thank all of those people who have been working incredibly hard in our managed isolation facilities. New Zealand Defence Force staff, police, health workers, security guards, and all of the hotel workers working in these facilities. These are an important part of our front line against COVID-19. They are allowing us to enjoy these incredible social and economic freedoms, and I want to acknowledge and thank them for their efforts. So I'll hand over to you, Air Commodore Webb, and then we'll be happy to take some questions after that.
Thank you, Minister. As of today, we've seen 32,221 New Zealanders return home and go through managed isolation and quarantine since the 26th of March. Our current capacity is provided by 32 managed isolation and quarantine facilities across 5 different regions. Allowing for room turnaround and contingency, we have space for 6,100 people. In regards to available capacity and current occupancy, in early July we met with key stakeholders and agreed to a 3-week suspension of additional airline ticketing. You'll recall me identifying that the system at that time was under tension, and this 3-week period enabled us to grow capacity by around 20%, increase resourcing, and then further develop our procedures. It also allowed time for the Ministry of Transport to develop and communicate that necessary policy. The licence conditions for airlines that align demand with supply will formally take effect from this Friday. A key point to remember in this system is that it's a rolling 14-day system, and what we now see is a rapidly increasing occupancy rate aligned to the resumption of ticketing data. For example, in the last 2 days we've seen 900 Kiwis arrive. As the daily fact sheet shows, we have a further forecast growth of 1,872 in the next week, and we expect to be near our effective maximum capacity of 6,100 in just over a fortnight. As I've said, airlines have clear visibility of our available capacity and will use their own systems in planning to match their ticket sales accordingly, and we certainly appreciate their support in managing those volumes back into New Zealand. Minister.
Can you explain how much this is going to save?
In terms of the costs and the revenue that are associated with it, it depends of course on the volumes of people that come in under various categories and what the structures of those families are. So there are quite large ranges. In terms of the revenue collected, it won't be huge, but one of the things that I was really struck by as we went through doing the policy work, that if we looked at if we were to look at, say, a universal charge where everybody paid, but we put in place the required waivers that would be required to meet our legal obligations for the rights of New Zealanders to return home for financial hardship and other measures, we would have only been looking at collecting probably somewhere around 125 million a year off that, and the cost of the system would have been around nearly 33 million, the mid-range of the cost of the system. So actually the ability to collect even under a universal system is reasonably limited because of the international obligations and our rights and our obligations under the Bill of Rights. But in terms of the revenue that we will collect under the system that we're talking about here, it's likely to be somewhere between in the range of under 10 million. But the costs, obviously, of that system will be significantly lower. What I've always kept a check on is that we will be collecting more than we're spending on the system.
Sorry, Barry. How is it fair for example, somebody who wants, a New Zealander living abroad, who wants to come here for a wedding, to meet with their family, that they have to pay now to come into the country that they're resident from?
So what we're saying is that any New Zealander that is returning home, that is returning to resettle here, to make their life here, that we are saying that actually you will be contributing to New Zealand, you will be making your life here, you will be paying taxes. This will be your home. And I think that what we know in terms of the continuum of risk along the ability to charge New Zealanders, it seemed increasingly obvious to me that that was a category that shouldn't be charging. What we are saying is that New Zealanders who are returning for a period of less than 90 days, who are choosing to come back for a visit, for a holiday, we've heard reports of some New Zealand residents and New Zealand citizens and permanent residents who have elected to come back for holidays. If you're choosing to do that in the midst of a global pandemic, when there is a cost on your fellow New Zealanders for your managed isolation, it is fair that you factor into the cost of that visit, the cost of your managed isolation. Of course, there does have to be some ability to waive those fees. If someone, for example, is returning home because a close family member is dying or to attend a funeral, we would not want to economically ration that. So there is some ability to waive fees, so we're not economically rationing the ability of people to see loved ones.
If the
Yeah.
group is so small, what's the point of doing it? Is it a deterrent to stop people from coming back altogether?
No, at the moment we don't have the basis for charging at all. I think every New Zealander would think that it is fair and the right balance, that if we're bringing in critical workers, that the companies that are bringing those in pay the fees rather than the taxpayers of New Zealanders pay those fees. I think every New Zealander would also think that it is fair that if, say, I elect to go on a holiday, but just factor in 2 weeks of isolation at the end of that holiday, that I'm not expecting New Zealand taxpayers to pick up the tab for that. Likewise, if I'm going overseas on business, that we're not expecting the New Zealand taxpayer to pick up the tab on that. We're also seeing people that are coming in that are only visiting for a short period of time. Likewise, New Zealanders that are here and paying tax, on balance, the fairness is those people should be paying. As I outlined in my earlier answer, we will be collecting more revenue than we will be spending on the system. So yes, it is worth it.
So how is the possible
How
point
would
of
you
this policy?
settle on the less than 90 days time frame? That seems like an extremely long holiday for someone to be taking.
Well, I think at the moment, given the world we're living in the midst of a global pandemic, given that people may need to be people will certainly have to do managed isolation of part of their holiday. We didn't want to make that period too short because they do need to factor in managed isolation. If people are travelling long distances, then they typically do come for long periods of time. Thank you.
Did the government give any consideration to different tiers of quality of accommodation and associated cost? Obviously, primarily you're putting people in 4-star, 5-star hotels, which explains the $3,000 cost. But what about if someone was willing to pay $1,500 or $1,000 but be at a lower level, just in terms of, you know, as you say, fairness for those who may not be able to afford that charge? Did you look at that?
So all of our managed isolation facilities are picked according to their adherence to health guidelines. They're not picked on their hotel star rating. There just happens that actually in order to be able to meet the strict criteria that health have set around what constitutes a safe managed isolation facility, these are the facilities that are meeting them. So we are not for one moment considering lowering our line of defence at the border in managed isolation. This is a critical way in which we are keeping COVID out of our country, and we need to make sure that we are following health guidelines around the kinds of facilities that are set up well to do that. And examples of what needs to be in place at these facilities is not having shared ablutions, separate bathrooms, the common areas being a certain size. Also, health have set some reasonable guidelines around the size of rooms that are required. When we're asking people to essentially stay in their room for 14 days, that health have set some guidelines around the size of those rooms.
So how much will it cost to collect the money?
There's a range of figures around that. The figure that we have is it's probably around $600,000 is the cost it will be.
Isn't this policy a total waste of time? I mean, you're talking $2 million to create 2 separate classes of New Zealanders. Right?
Absolutely not. This is absolutely critical that we put this in place. I don't think that there anyone who thinks it would be fair for the New Zealand taxpayer to pay for the managed isolation if you or I elected to go on holiday, and that we factored in isolation at the end of it. I think if someone's been going overseas on a business trip, likewise it should not be the New Zealand taxpayer who is picking up the bill for that. If we're having people, New Zealanders Zealanders who are returning home essentially for a holiday and aren't looking to resettle and make their lives here. I think most people would agree that it is fair and just that in...
People are actually doing that?
Oh, look, what we do have advice on is the flow of people that we can manage through our facilities, and we also, what we do know is that there is 600,000 to 900,000 New Zealanders who are living outside of New Zealand at the moment, the majority of those people living in Australia. But at the moment, the world is a rapidly evolving and changing place. So any attempt to actually put numbers around the people who are going to make particular choices is particularly difficult at the moment because things change on a daily basis.
The key problem is this trying to fix, because you're talking $9 million to defray, I think costs of 490 million. Isn't this just total tokenism?
Absolutely not. What this does, and it's in two parts, it sets up the enabling legislation that does actually allow us to charge. Bear in mind, we don't have the ability to charge at all until this legislative change is made. Then through secondary legislation, through regulations, we will define those cohorts of people. It is important that we are making sure that we are doing this within a framework that isn't easily contestable in the courts. One of the things that I have been struck by in the 6 weeks that I've been looking at this now, one of the things that is incredibly important is that we have stability and consistency around our managed isolation facilities so they can do the job they're meant to do. The last thing I want to see is to stand up a regime around charging and have government appropriations based on a level of collections that then the courts overturn, and we're left in a situation where we don't have that certainty of funding for these facilities.
What do you make of the
down the
foreign
back.
minister saying it was dreadful public policy?
Sorry?
What do you make of the foreign minister saying that it was a dreadful public policy because it only affected a tiny, tiny amount of New Zealanders?
What I say is that this is public policy that is making sure that we are consistent with what our legal obligations to New Zealanders are. I think it's a balanced piece of public policy that does balance the right of those New Zealanders who want to return home, to make their lives here, to work here, to pay tax here, to send their kids to school here, with the ability for us to collect over people who are either New Zealanders who are seeking to be holiday makers overseas, or New Zealanders who live overseas and are seeking to be holiday makers in their country of birth.
Do you agree with Minister? What's to stop? But you say it sets up the ability to charge. So does that mean that economic exemptions like the Avatar mob, you haven't actually filled them yet?
No, there have been regimes, but this sets up a framework that does actually allow us to charge citizens and permanent residents as well.
And secondarily, on policing it, what's to stop me flying back saying I'm going to live in New Zealand, then skiing up a storm in Queenstown and leaving 14 days later?
Well, there will need to be, and that's one of the pieces of work that we're working through with MB around that, in terms of the way in which we can use data, whether we can use the normal kind of data matching that is used, for example, to monitor when someone on a pension leaves the country for more than a longer period of time than the rules allow and the superannuation allow. So we're working around the specifics around that as we work up the regulations, but also we are working on a trust model as well.
Winston Peters is really laying in here, basically saying that Labour and the Greens are after overseas votes. Are you after overseas voters?
Look, there is no one that would be returning that couldn't vote if they were overseas. Sorry, Audrey.
Yeah, if there's a, say an adult living in Australia who wants to come back and see an elderly parent, will they be treated differently if the parent is A, healthy, B, sick, or C, dying? Will they have an exemption for one of those or all of them?
So in terms of the people's ability to pay and whether or not, so what I said in the initial comments was we're not going to economically ration the ability of someone to come home and see a dying relative or a sick relative, and what will be in place is the Chief Executive of MB will have the ability to do waivers on paying fees.
An elderly parent, say a 95-year-old parent, if someone wants to come and see them, I mean, you might call it a holiday, someone would just call it a duty.
No.
Would they be exempt?
No, and Audrey, there is an absolute acceptance that we do need to have the ability to do waivers for people to come back for funerals or to see sick or dying relatives and to have those final moments of grief with them. And that will be administered through a discretionary waiver by the Chief Executive of MB.
How's it going to work? Are you going to need a letter from a doctor saying, yes, your relative is going to die?
Oh, look, we're working through a process, and Commodore Webb might want to talk about the exemption process that he's working through at the moment in terms of the ability to leave these facilities. So we are working through and have processes set up to deal with circumstances that are about the particulars of people's lives, which actually do need to be looked at a subjective basis because it is particular to the circumstances of the family that you're dealing with. So we'll work in the way that we're working it now.
Realistically need some kind of charging regime in place before you realistically start looking at bubbles.
In terms of, well, I mean, of course, if you were to have a bubble with either a trans-Tasman bubble or a state-by-state bubble, that does make this whole system a whole lot simpler in terms of managed isolation more broadly. But I think that what we have given a commitment to, that as we evolve through this, everyone also, I think, recognises that our managed isolation facilities is one of the most important public health measures we have in place to ensure that we are keeping COVID out of our communities, and that we need to work through this in a balanced and fair way to make sure that we are allowing New Zealanders their legal right to return home, but doing what is fair to the New Zealand taxpayer as well. We would need to do this with or without a bubble.
Do you have an estimation of how many of is it roughly 300,000 people that have, or 32,000 people that have come through those facilities? Do you have an estimate of how many of them would potentially have been charged if this regime was in place?
We don't have the exact data on those to hand, but from what we've seen so far, it would be a relatively minor number.
If you're looking at 10 million a year, that would be roughly 3,200 adults. Is that approximately what you're estimating the number will be?
In terms of flow, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, I would say that would be approximately correct.
What percent, and like how many would be coming in over a year?
So at the moment, the regime as it is stood up is we're talking about a capacity of around 7,000 people at any one time on a 15-day cycle. So that's around 14,000 people over a year. Extrapolate that out over 12 months.
Says the first proposal was to charge everyone coming in. Under the legal advice that you sought, would you have ground to do that?
Look, in terms of the legal advice, and we worked through very closely with Crown Law around what we could do. One of the things is that there is a continuum of risk that goes in place. What you cannot do, and absolutely cannot do, is stand up a system that has no ability for exemptions or waivers. There has to be an ability for people who can't afford to return, to afford the costs of managed isolation to be able to return. So the first step was there did need to be a waiver system that needed to be put in place, so we weren't economically rationing the ability of New Zealanders to return home. So looking at that, and if we played that out, as I said, if we looked at the amount of revenue, if we put those layers through the number of people going through over an annualised basis, we'd probably only be looking at collecting around $125.8 million, and the regime to do the collection would be at the midpoint around $32.9 million. So we'd actually only be looking at collecting less than $100 million over it. So it was a range of looking at the operational practicalities and the legal advice.
10 times what you're projecting to recoup with the system though.
Yes, and what we also know is for that amount of money we still put ourselves further down the continuum of legal risk around its challenge, around how it could be challenged in the courts and whether or not that would stand up. Working with Crown Law and with the Solicitor General, it's harder to justify a blanket approach when it comes to charging than the system we have settled on. We think that this is less challengeable in the courts, and one of the things that I have right at the front of my mind is the fact that we have to have stability in all senses around our managed isolation. We need to know as a government what it is going to cost us. The last thing I want to do is stand up a charging regime the courts then overturn, and we have to find additional funding for it. I'd rather that we do take the approach we have and that we have set aside the money for it.
Did the legal threat from people in the UK come and factor into your decision into this regime?
Oh no, the legal threat has been identified right from the beginning by Crown Law around what our obligations as a country to allow people to continue to return. That has been well identified and well understood for a number of months about what the limitations of us to put any impediments on the rights of New Zealanders to return home.
Will this effectively kill off any international tourism to New Zealand?
Oh, this is about New Zealand citizens and permanent residents.
No, but I mean, like, if there are any people visiting as tourists, they wouldn't be coming under the scheme pretty much, right?
Well, no one is getting issued a visitor visa at the moment. That is not a class of visa that is being issued. The only people who can enter New Zealand and enter the managed isolation facilities are those people who are New Zealand citizens or permanent residents who are coming in as critical or essential workers, or are the partners of New Zealand citizens or permanent residents.
Tourists at the moment.
Oh, so you're talking about New Zealand citizens or permanent residents coming as tourists? Right, well they certainly can choose to come. They just need to factor in and budget in as part of the cost of returning for a holiday in New Zealand, the cost of managed isolation.
Should they be coming as tourists during a global pandemic, in your opinion?
Oh, look, what we're saying, what is the fair and balanced way to approach this? If someone chooses to do that, they have a right to come home. They are a New Zealand citizen or permanent resident. There is no ability to stop them. But if they are choosing to do that, I think the fair way and the balanced way to manage this is to ask them to contribute to the costs of their managed isolation.
Crown Law advice, what was your perfect vision of this, and how did the Green Party change it? Because they put on a PR saying that they basically stopped this fee being brought.
Well, thank you. Well, my ideal solution to this was one that was legal and one that could be implemented, and one that, from a practical point of view, we could make sure continue to ensure that New Zealand's managed isolation and quarantine facilities offers the strong line of defence that New Zealanders expect and require. These are critical facilities to ensuring that we continue to see New Zealand being kept COVID-free in our communities, and they are the reason why we are enjoying the social and economic liberties that we are here in New Zealand.
Did the Green Party want any concessions?
Look, this was an agreement that we talked about across all parties of government. From a legal and a practical point of view, when I looked at the evidence, I think the place that we have landed is the right place to land. But I talked to colleagues across all parties in government.
What conversations have you had with Winston Peters about this? Were you aware he was deeply unhappy with
this? We have discussed this on multiple occasions, and yes, I was aware that New Zealand First will vote for the legislation because they do want to see the ability to have a charging regime put in place. But I'm also aware that New Zealand First would like to see it go further. But that is the nature of a coalition government.
You've talked about getting something over the line that would be legally defensible. If you thought it was legally defensible to block New Zealand citizens from coming back, would you have done so?
Look, actually there's a really practical consideration that comes into this as well. Look, when I look at it and actually look at the what can actually realistically be collected once you put in place all the waivers and the non-payments and put up against the cost of what it will cost to do those collections, and I see what a small amount of money in the context of what we're doing. I think that in terms of ensuring that we have the stability of funding, that we have surety over the fact that we are going to retain this critical line of defence for New Zealand, I land very much from both a legal and a practical solution, as well as what is the rights of New Zealanders where we've landed today. Now, there was a question over here.
Will compassionate exemptions be considered for New Zealanders currently in the country who leave to, say, visit a sort of dying relative in Australia, then obviously have to return?
Yes.
So that will apply?
Yes.
Okay.
Pass this under urgency in the next 2 weeks?
Yes.
What is the time?
There's only a few sitting days left. I think urgency will be required.
Does have a normal broiler set timeline for it to come into effect, or is there
Sorry?
the normal broiler set timeline for it to come into effect, or are you going to set some date for it to all come into effect?
So my intention is to take regulations to Cabinet next week, and that it would come into effect. The way in which the legislation is drafted is basically the regulations activate it. So my expectation is that we could, all going well, that we could have those regulations in place within the next 2 to 3 weeks.
Do you have the systems in place in order to implement those charges?
Yes, and we're working on them.
New Zealanders have already booked their flights and don't intend to stay for 90 days.
So returning New Zealanders.
They've already made their plans on the assumption that they won't be charged and they're not planning on staying for 90 days.
Well, I think there's been discussion about the possibility of charging that has been underway for a period of time now, and it will be a cost that will need to be factored in. But if there is a set of circumstances that require those fees to be waived for any reason, that is at the discretion of the Chief Executive of MB.
Do you have an idea of how many people are going overseas on holidays?
Look, it's not a huge number at the moment, but I think as we kind of go through this and it changes, that is set to increase. I mean, anecdotally, we do know that more and more people are starting to go overseas on business trips, for example, and I don't think it's fair that the taxpayers of New Zealand should be picking up the fees for that.
Huge. What sort of, is it under 100?
It is a small number at the moment, but it is a number that we can see growing in the future. I'll just take 2 more questions.
On another matter, a couple of weeks ago we were here and someone had escaped a facility in Auckland and gone to Countdown, etc. And there was a bit of confusion about, how Countdown should shut down, how it should be cleaned. Is there a policy in place now to make sure that if someone enters a property, health authorities know what to do?
Yeah, absolutely, and good question. So the public health concerns are absolutely paramount in our thinking towards any response. Those instances provided an opportunity to make sure that the really key agencies lined up, being ourselves as the response, the health departments and the police, are completely lined up. We've had a chance to refine our procedures, and you'll have seen in the last instances where those people who chose to break the law and escape our facilities were quickly apprehended, and everything worked in accordance with the plan.
Walk into a supermarket. What happens now if someone walks into a supermarket?
From a facility. So, as I say, we have really good communications with the public health departments. We have a response plan which was triggered instantaneously. We have connections between whatever facility is affected and that region, and we can really rapidly work out what the issue is, what we need to do in terms of public health risk, the contact tracing to implement, and any follow-up measures.
Commodore, just like really quick back of the napkin kind of calculations, about 3% of people might be affected by this fee that are returning?
Out of the 32,000 you're talking about?
Well, no, I mean just going forward, if you're expecting 3,200 a year, roughly that's about 3% of returnees.
It would be somewhere between 3 and 10%, I would say, but we will obviously do work to refine that.
Minister, with capacity in managed isolation well below 100% at the moment, is the government of a mind to accept more of the people keen to come to New Zealand for economic reasons, like the Avatar mob, like the America's Cup, which is something that obviously would make the government some money?
So the capacity has been low over the last few days, but I think if you look at the forward projections around the incoming flows, you see that is not a situation that lasts for very long. That, for example, today, that there are 434 people incoming into a facility, and we see that we're really ramping up that capacity again. Why that capacity was low for a period of time, it was while we sought to make sure that we'd put in place all the additional measures to make sure that our managed isolation and quarantine facilities were the absolute safest places that they could be. But look, we do need to ensure that we are providing facilities for New Zealanders who do have a right to return home to complete their managed isolation and facility. We are continuing to work through what capacity might look like for any other economic categories, but that is obviously policy work that we need to work through, and we need to make sure that we are working within what are justifiable timelines for a New Zealander or permanent resident to return home in the midst of a global pandemic. I don't know if you've got anything you want to add to that.
I would just say we have 32 facilities. Each of those facilities requires, as I've said in the past, the key support mechanisms to be in place, being the health support, the wraparound support, and the necessary hotel criteria as set by health guidelines. We continue to assess whether or not there are additional facilities that we would want to look at, and part of that assessment considers the time span, so how long these things will take to bring to bear. But when you weigh all of that up, right now we feel we're pretty close to the top.
Representing New Zealand in sport overseas have to pay for quarantine on their return?
I think there'll be some complexity to this about whether or not they're playing professional sport, whether they're going overseas for work, for example. So that there'll be a set of circumstances that would actually require closer looking at what lies underneath that question.
What happens if someone loses their job overseas and doesn't have the money to pay for this? Could they sort of get a loan, or say they're in Australia, they lose their job, and then they need to come back to get the job seekers benefit in New Zealand.
So they'd be coming back to live.
Yeah.
They wouldn't be paying. So people who are returning to New Zealand to live here will not be paying for their managed isolation. Yes.
Students coming.
At the moment, we don't have visa provisions for international students to come in. So that's a...
International students come back.
Look, when we get into that situation beyond New Zealand citizens and residents, we will need to be looking at charging regimes.
Need to charge them, like the student loan scheme? Is that the best way to charge people?
We did look at that around the kind of range of options that were being looked at, but given the scheme that we've settled on, that is not the likely scenario at this stage. But look, I did say 2 questions about 6 questions ago, so I think we'll wrap it up there. Okay, thank you.